My brother mocked my fake military job at Thanksgiving. His special forces buddy saw my credentials, snapped to attention, and said, "Sir, do you know what unit she's with?" The fork in my hand stopped halfway to my mouth when I heard Ethan say it. "Yeah, my sister plays pretend soldier. Does some desk job at Fort Meade, types emails, probably files paperwork, not like real military work." He said it loud enough that the entire Thanksgiving table heard, loud enough that his buddy from his Army Ranger days, sitting directly across from me, looked up with interest. I set the fork down carefully, watching the cranberry sauce slide off the sweet potato I'd speared, and felt my face go hot. Not from embarrassment, from rage that I'd spent 8 years learning to control in situations exactly like this. My mother made a small noise of protest, my father shifted uncomfortably, and my younger sister Olivia shot me a look that clearly said, "Please don't make a scene." But Ethan wasn't done. He turned to his friend, a guy he'd introduced as Nathan Riggs, former 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, and currently working private security. "She won't even tell us what she actually does, claims it's classified." He used air quotes, around the word classified, like it was a joke, like the security clearance that had taken 18 months to obtain and required polygraphs and interviews with every person I'd known since childhood was something I'd invented to sound important. I'd been serving in the United States Army for 8 years when that Thanksgiving dinner happened, the last 4 of which had been spent doing work I genuinely couldn't discuss with anyone outside specific secure facilities. My name is Jordan Whitlock. I'm 31 years old, and I held the rank of captain in a unit that doesn't appear on organizational charts and doesn't have recruiting posters. My official assignment was with the Intelligence and Security Command, but my actual work involved cryptologic operations and signals intelligence that I literally could not describe without violating federal law and my top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance. The paperwork I'd signed when I joined my current unit made it crystal clear that unauthorized disclosure could result in criminal prosecution, imprisonment, and penalties that would destroy my career and possibly my life. So when family asked what I did, I said I worked in intelligence analysis at Fort Meade, which was technically true, but left out about 90% of what my job actually involved. Most of them accepted this. My parents understood that some military work was sensitive. Olivia, who was 26 and worked as a teacher, trusted that if I said I couldn't talk about something, I had good reasons. But Ethan, my 33-year-old brother who'd served 6 years as an Army infantry officer before leaving the service to work in finance, had decided somewhere along the way that my inability to discuss my work meant I didn't do anything important. It had started small, little comments at family gatherings about how his deployments had been real combat while I'd probably never left an office building. Jokes about how intelligence work was for people who couldn't hack it in real military roles. References to my job as a 9-to-5, and comparisons to his time leading patrols in Iraq where he'd actually been in danger. I'd tried explaining that different military roles served different purposes, that intelligence operations were critical to mission success, that what I did mattered even if I couldn't describe it. But every explanation came across as defensive because I couldn't provide specifics. Couldn't point to concrete achievements or operations or missions that would prove I'd done something significant. Everything I'd worked on for the past 4 years was classified at levels that meant I couldn't even acknowledge whether specific programs existed. So Ethan's narrative had gradually calcified into family mythology. He was the real soldier who'd served in combat, and I was the little sister who joined the military, but ended up in some bureaucratic support role that let me pretend I was important. And over time, watching him bask in the family's respect and admiration for his service while treating mine as basically clerical work, I'd grown quietly furious in a way that had no outlet. Nathan Riggs was looking at me now with polite interest, probably trying to figure out what to say that wouldn't be rude to his friend's sister. He was maybe 35, fit in the way that soldiers stay fit even after leaving service, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent time in harsh environments. Ethan had mentioned that Nathan had left the Rangers 3 years ago and was now working for a private military contractor doing security for corporate clients in hostile regions, which probably meant he was making 3 times what I made and had war stories that would make Ethan's deployment sound tame. "What do you do at Meade?" Nathan asked, and his tone was genuinely curious, not condescending. I appreciated that he was trying to include me in conversation despite Ethan's dismissive introduction. I gave him the standard answer, the one I'd rehearsed hundreds of times. "I work in intelligence analysis, signals intelligence primarily, monitoring and interpreting electronic communications. It's mostly computer work, nothing particularly exciting." The lie of omission tasted familiar by now. Nathan nodded like that made sense, and Ethan jumped back in before the conversation could develop further. "See, computer work. She stares at screens all day. Meanwhile, I was outside the wire in Ramadi, actually engaging the enemy, actually putting my life on the line." Ethan's voice had that edge it got when he'd had a few drinks, sharper and louder and more aggressive. He'd put away 3 beers before dinner and was working on his 4th. "She gets to call herself a soldier, gets the same thank you for your service treatment, but she's never been in a firefight, never pulled security on a convoy, never done anything that actually required courage." Mom made a more forceful sound of protest this time, and Dad set down his glass with enough force to make silverware rattle. "Ethan, that's enough. Your sister serves her country just like you did. Different roles, same commitment." Ethan waved him off. I'm not saying she doesn't contribute. I'm saying there's a difference between real military service and whatever she does in her air-conditioned office building. She wouldn't last a day doing what I did, what Nathan does. Real soldiers put their lives at risk. She manages computer files. The worst part was that I couldn't argue with him, not effectively, because proving him wrong would require describing things I legally couldn't discuss. I couldn't tell him about the deployment I'd done to a classified location where I'd worked 16-hour shifts in a secure facility processing intelligence that directly supported strike operations. I couldn't mention the commendation I'd received for work that identified a high-value target's communication patterns. I couldn't describe the week I'd spent in a tactical operations center during a time-sensitive mission, providing real-time intelligence to forces in contact with enemy combatants. All of that was classified. The awards were classified. Even acknowledging that certain operations had occurred was classified. So I sat there, silent and seething, while my brother painted me as a fraud who'd never done anything meaningful. Nathan was watching this exchange with growing discomfort, clearly recognizing that family dynamics were more complicated than he'd expected when accepting a Thanksgiving dinner invitation. He tried to redirect. Intelligence work is critical. We relied on it constantly downrange. The guys doing signals intelligence, imagery analysis, all of that, they saved lives by giving us information we needed. It was a kind attempt at defense, but Ethan just laughed. Sure, and I'm sure Jordan contributes to that somehow. Files reports that other people write, probably. Runs the coffee machine for the people doing actual analysis. He turned to me with that smile he got when he knew he was being an asshole but was enjoying it anyway. Come on, Jordan. Just admit it. You sit in an office building, nowhere near danger, doing computer work that any civilian with security clearance could do. You're not special forces, you're not combat arms, you're not even real intelligence. You're administrative support wearing a uniform. The rage I felt at that moment was cold and sharp, the kind that makes your vision narrow and your hands want to form fists. I'd spent 8 years proving myself in an environment where being female meant constantly fighting assumptions about capability and toughness. I'd completed the same basic training as any other soldier, the same officer candidate school, the same intelligence training pipeline. I'd worked my way into a unit that had selection standards most soldiers never passed, where the failure rate was over 50% and where my gender had made me an immediate target for skepticism. And I'd succeeded. I'd earned my place. I'd done work that mattered, that saved lives, that contributed to national security in ways that Ethan's infantry deployments never would. But I couldn't say any of that, couldn't prove any of it, couldn't defend myself without violating the secrecy oaths that defined my entire career. I stood up from the table carefully and excused myself to the bathroom. Needed a minute to breathe, to remember my training about emotional control and maintaining composure under pressure. The bathroom mirror showed me a woman in civilian clothes, jeans, and a sweater, who looked nothing like the soldier I was when I put on the uniform. I splashed cold water on my face and reminded myself that Ethan's opinion didn't matter, that the people who knew what I actually did understood its value, that proving myself to my family wasn't worth the risk of disclosing classified information. I repeated these things like mantras, but they didn't help. The fundamental unfairness of the situation remained. When I returned to the table 5 minutes later, the conversation had moved on to football, and everyone was carefully pretending the previous exchange hadn't happened. Mom served pie, Dad refilled drinks, and Olivia tried to engage me in conversation about her students. I played along because that's what you do at family gatherings. You perform normalcy even when you're angry enough to flip the table. But Nathan kept glancing at me with a thoughtful expression, like something didn't add up in his assessment. Around 8 p.m., after we'd cleared dishes and moved to the living room, Nathan asked if he could see my challenge coin collection. I'd mentioned during dinner that I collected military coins, a hobby most service members shared. I brought down the display case from my room, and Nathan examined the various coins I'd accumulated over the years. Unit coins, deployment coins, coins from various commanders and senior enlisted leaders. He picked up several, reading the inscriptions, making appreciative comments about different units and missions. Then he reached a coin I'd tucked in the back corner, one I should have removed before showing anyone the collection. The coin was matte black with minimal markings, no unit designation, just a set of numbers and a small symbol that meant nothing to most people, but would be immediately recognizable to anyone who'd worked in certain communities. Nathan picked it up, examined it closely, and his entire body language changed. He went very still, the way soldiers do when processing information that contradicts their expectations. He looked at the coin, then at me, then back at the coin. Where did you get this? His voice had changed too, no longer casual, suddenly very professional and precise. I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly which coin he was holding, and I knew what it represented, and I knew I'd made a mistake by not hiding it before showing him the collection. It was given to me by my commander, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. Nathan stood up, still holding the coin, and his expression had gone from thoughtful to something closer to shock. Jordan, do you know what unit this is from? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Nathan looked at Ethan, who was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Ethan, Nathan said, and his tone made my brother look up. Do you know what unit your sister is with? Ethan shrugged, annoyed at being interrupted. Some intelligence thing at Mead. Why? Nathan held up the coin. This is from the intelligence support activity. Do you have any idea what that is? Ethan looked blank. Nathan's expression suggested he was reconsidering his friendship with someone who could be this uninformed about his own sister's service. The activity is one of the most classified units in the entire military. They do direct action support, technical intelligence, electronic warfare. These are the people who found high-value targets before JSOC sent in teams to get them. If your sister has this coin, if she's actually assigned to that unit, she's done things that make my Ranger deployments look like summer camp. The room had gone completely silent. Mom and Dad were staring. Olivia's mouth was literally open. Ethan sat up straighter, his phone forgotten. She works at a desk, Ethan stammered, and for the first time all night he sounded uncertain. Nathan laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Yeah, she probably does work at a desk. Know what they do at desks in that unit? They track terrorist communications, break enemy encryption, coordinate intelligence for kill capture missions. The activity doesn't have desk jobs in the way you're thinking. Everyone there is doing work that directly enables special operations. Nathan turned to me, and I saw the exact moment he remembered I was a captain and he was a civilian, because his posture shifted slightly, not quite to attention but closer to a position of respect. Ma'am, I apologize for anything I said earlier that suggested your work wasn't significant. I should have recognized the indicators. I shook my head. You didn't say anything inappropriate, and I can't confirm or deny anything about my assignment. The formula response for discussing classified units, the one I'd been taught to use if anyone ever made connections I couldn't acknowledge. Nathan smiled slightly. Of course not, ma'am. But for the record, if someone hypothetically worked for the organization represented by that coin, they would have my complete respect, and I would recognize that they'd accomplish things I likely never will. He set the coin back in the case carefully, almost reverently. Then he turned to Ethan, and his expression had gone cold. You spent all night suggesting your sister was basically a clerk. You mocked her service, implied she'd never done anything dangerous or meaningful. You have no idea what she does, man. No idea at all. Ethan's face had gone red, and I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment or anger or some combination. She never told me she was in some special unit. She said she did intelligence analysis. Nathan's laugh was sharp and bitter. Because she's not allowed to tell you, you idiot. She's doing work that requires security clearances above what most generals have access to. The fact that you thought her secrecy meant she wasn't important instead of realizing it meant she was doing something actually classified just shows how little you understand about how the military actually works. The Thanksgiving gathering fell apart quickly after that. Ethan made some excuse about needing to leave early, avoiding eye contact with me as he gathered his coat. Nathan apologized again before following him out, but made a point of shaking my hand and saying he hoped to talk more sometime if I was ever able to discuss my work. After they left, my parents and Olivia sat in stunned silence for a long moment before Dad spoke. Why didn't you tell us you were in some kind of elite unit? The question stung because I had tried to tell them, in every way I could without violating security protocols, that my work mattered. I did tell you it was classified. I told you I couldn't discuss details. What else was I supposed to say? Mom looked stricken. We thought you were just being modest. We didn't realize you were literally prohibited from talking about it. I felt exhaustion wash over me, the accumulated weight of years of being dismissed and underestimated and unable to defend myself. It doesn't matter now, I said, even though it clearly did matter. I'm going to bed. Thank you for dinner. I left them in the living room and went upstairs to my childhood bedroom that I stayed in during holiday visits, and lay in the dark trying to process what had just happened. Part of me felt vindicated finally, after years of Ethan's mockery. But another part felt exposed and vulnerable because Nathan's recognition meant I'd been careless with operational security, had revealed more than I should have through a stupid coin collection. The fallout continued over the following days. Ethan sent a text message around midnight, clearly drunk, that said, "Why didn't you just tell me you were actually doing something important instead of letting me think you were a nobody?" I didn't respond because any response would have required acknowledging things I still couldn't acknowledge, and because his phrasing revealed he still didn't understand. I hadn't let him think anything. I told him repeatedly that I couldn't discuss my work, and he'd chosen to interpret that as meaning my work wasn't worth discussing. He'd constructed an entire narrative about my career based on his own assumptions and his need to feel superior, and the fact that the narrative turned out to be wrong didn't change the years he'd spent mocking me. Mom called the next morning, wanting to talk about the revelations from Thanksgiving. She'd apparently spent hours on Google researching the intelligence support activity and had found very little information, which she seemed to think proved how secret and important it was. I had no idea you were involved in such dangerous work, she said, and I had to resist the urge to point out that she'd been told many times that my work was classified, but had never bothered to consider what that might mean. Instead, I said that I still couldn't discuss my assignment or my work, and that nothing had changed just because Nathan had recognized a coin. She wanted to know if I'd been in danger, if I'd deployed to combat zones, if I'd done things she should be worried about. All questions I couldn't answer directly. I told her I was safe, that I was good at my job, and that she needed to trust me when I said I couldn't provide details. She promised to respect my boundaries, but I could hear in her voice that she was hurt by the continued secrecy. Olivia's reaction was different. She called me a few days later and said simply, "I'm sorry we didn't take you seriously. You kept saying your work was classified and we just thought you were being dramatic or self-important. I didn't realize you meant it literally." The apology meant something because it acknowledged the actual problem, which wasn't that they didn't know what I did, but that they hadn't believed me when I told them I couldn't explain. We talked for an hour about nothing in particular, just catching up on her teaching job and my non-work life, and it felt like the first real conversation we'd had in years where she wasn't treating me like I was playing dress-up in a uniform. The situation with Ethan deteriorated rather than improved. He called 3 days after Thanksgiving, sober this time, and launched into a defensive rant about how I'd made him look stupid in front of his friend. I pointed out that he'd made himself look stupid by spending years mocking my service based on assumptions rather than facts. He said I could have corrected those assumptions at any time. I asked him how exactly I was supposed to correct assumptions when the actual facts were classified, and I was legally prohibited from discussing them. He didn't have an answer for that, but he also didn't apologize for years of dismissive comments and jokes at my expense. Instead, he said he'd thought we had a normal sibling rivalry, that his teasing was just brotherly joking, and that I was being oversensitive by holding it against him. That's when I realized he genuinely didn't understand the difference between normal sibling teasing and what he'd been doing. Normal teasing is affectionate, has boundaries, stops when someone indicates they're actually hurt. What Ethan had done was publicly diminish my career and service at every family gathering for years, had undermined my credibility and achievements, had created a family narrative where his military service was legitimate and mine was basically cosplay. And he'd done it knowing I couldn't effectively defend myself, which made it worse. I told him that his teasing had crossed lines repeatedly, that his behavior had been hurtful and disrespectful, and that the fact that he didn't intend harm didn't erase the harm he'd caused. Ethan got defensive, said I was overreacting, claimed he'd always been proud of my service even if he joked about it. I asked him to name one time in the past 4 years when he'd expressed pride or respect for my military career without qualifying it with suggestions that it wasn't real service. He couldn't. The conversation ended with him saying I was being unreasonable, and me saying he was being willfully oblivious. We didn't speak for 3 months after that. Christmas came and went without any communication between us. Mom tried to mediate, suggesting we were both being stubborn and should reconcile for the sake of family harmony. I told her I was willing to have a relationship with Ethan, but only if he genuinely understood why his behavior had been hurtful and apologized for it. She said I was asking too much, that families should forgive each other's flaws. I said there was a difference between flaws and sustained patterns of disrespect, and that forgiving Ethan without him acknowledging what he'd done wrong would just enable future bad behavior. The incident had broader ripple effects beyond my immediate family. Nathan apparently told other people in his security company about what happened, and word spread through certain military and contractor circles that Ethan had been publicly humiliating his sister who worked for a classified unit. People who worked in or around the special operations community have strong opinions about respecting the contributions of support elements, because they know better than anyone how critical intelligence and technical operations are to mission success. Ethan started getting cold shoulders from contacts who'd previously been friendly. Invitations stopped coming for industry events where he'd been networking, and his reputation in circles that valued military service took a hit. He blamed me for this, sent an angry email in February accusing me of deliberately embarrassing him to damage his professional relationships. I responded that I hadn't told anyone outside our family about the Thanksgiving incident, that if his reputation was suffering it was because Nathan and others were judging him based on his own behavior, and that maybe he should consider why military and veteran communities were reacting negatively to learning how he'd treated his sister's service. He didn't respond to that email. The professional consequences for Ethan apparently got worse over the spring. A private security contract he'd been expecting to land went to a competitor, and he heard through back channels that his dismissive attitude toward intelligence and support personnel had been cited as a concern. The industry he worked in valued people who understood how different military elements worked together, and Ethan had demonstrated through his treatment of me that he didn't grasp those interdependencies. He lost out on at least 2 significant business opportunities because people who mattered in that world had decided he lacked the professional maturity and judgment they wanted in their teams. Meanwhile, my own career continued normally. The Thanksgiving incident had no official impact because Nathan hadn't actually disclosed anything improper, and I hadn't confirmed anything beyond acknowledging I had the coin. My command never knew about the family drama, and my security clearance remained intact. I deployed again in March, spending 3 months at a classified location doing the kind of work I still can't describe, and came back to Fort Meade in June to resume my regular duties. The work remained challenging and meaningful, and the respect I received from colleagues who understood what our unit did mattered more than any validation from family. But the situation with Ethan still gnawed at me because part of me wanted him to genuinely understand and apologize, while another part recognized he might never get there. In July, 6 months after Thanksgiving, Ethan called and asked if we could meet in person to talk. I was skeptical but agreed, and we met at a coffee shop halfway between his place in Maryland and my apartment near Fort Meade. He looked tired when he arrived, older than his 33 years, and there was something defeated in his posture that I hadn't seen before. We ordered coffee and sat in uncomfortable silence for a minute before he spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thanksgiving," Ethan said, and his voice was quieter than usual, less confident. "I talked to Nathan and some other people about what happened. I read everything I could find about the intelligence support activity and similar units. I talked to a therapist about family dynamics and my need to feel superior, and I've realized I've been an asshole to you for years." The admission caught me off guard because I'd expected defensiveness or justification, not acknowledgement. "I think I knew on some level that your work was important," he continued, staring at his coffee cup rather than making eye contact. "But admitting that would have meant accepting that your service was as valid as mine, maybe more significant in some ways. And I'd built so much of my identity around being the combat veteran, the son who'd actually deployed and faced danger. Having a little sister who might be doing more important things threatened that identity. So I diminished your work, made jokes about it, convinced myself and everyone else that you were basically clerical support. It made me feel better about myself, and I didn't care or didn't let myself acknowledge how much it hurt you." I sipped my coffee, waiting to see if he'd continue. "The thing is," Ethan said, finally looking at me, "I do know what it's like to not be taken seriously for your service. When I left the Army and went into finance, other veterans in that industry treated me like I'd sold out, like I wasn't a real veteran anymore because I was working a civilian job. It made me angry and defensive, and somehow I never connected that experience to what I was doing to you. I was treating you the same way those guys treated me, dismissing your service because it didn't fit my narrow definition of what counted as legitimate military work." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "I wrote you a letter. It's an apology, a real one, where I take responsibility for being disrespectful and hurtful. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately or maybe at all, but I needed to acknowledge what I did and try to make it right, even if it's too late." I took the envelope but didn't open it yet. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did it take 6 months and professional consequences for you to realize you'd been treating me badly?" Ethan winced but didn't look away. "Honestly, because I'm selfish and stubborn and I didn't want to admit I'd been wrong. I told myself you were overreacting, that it was just sibling teasing, that you should have told me directly to stop if it really bothered you. I made excuses. Then I lost that contract because the people evaluating me decided I didn't respect intelligence personnel enough to work effectively with them. And Nathan, who I respected, told me he was disappointed in me, said I'd treated my own sister worse than we'd treated enemy combatants in terms of basic respect. That got through to me in a way nothing else had. I had to face that I'd been cruel to you for years, and had justified it by pretending you weren't really a soldier." There was silence between us for a moment, the coffee shop noise filling the space. "I spent 8 years proving myself," I said finally, my voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Proving I belonged in the military, proving I could handle the training, proving I deserved my assignment. And the whole time, my own brother was telling everyone who'd listen that I was a fake, that I wasn't really serving, that my work didn't matter. Do you have any idea how demoralizing that was? Coming home for holidays and having to sit through your jokes and condescension while knowing I couldn't defend myself, couldn't explain what I actually did?" Ethan nodded, and his eyes were wet. "I know. And I'm sorry. That's inadequate. I know it doesn't undo years of damage, but I am genuinely sorry. You deserved support and respect from me, and instead I gave you mockery and dismissal. I was a shitty brother, and I'm trying to be better now, even if it's too late to fix what I broke." I opened the envelope and read his letter. It was 3 pages, handwritten, detailed, and specific about what he'd done wrong and how it had been hurtful and inappropriate. He acknowledged specific incidents I'd mentioned in past conversations, things I'd assumed he'd forgotten or dismissed. He described the impact of learning from Nathan and others how significant my work likely was, and how he'd felt ashamed that strangers respected my service more than her own brother had. He promised to do better, to actually listen when I said something was hurtful, to respect boundaries around classified information instead of treating secrecy as suspicious. The letter ended with a simple request, that I give him a chance to rebuild trust and prove he'd changed. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. "I appreciate this," I said carefully. "I appreciate that you're acknowledging what happened and taking responsibility, but I need you to understand that this isn't fixed just because you apologized. You spent years building a narrative about my service that damaged how our family sees me and how I see myself. Mom and Dad still don't fully understand what I do because for so long they heard your version and believed it. Olivia treated my career as less important because you set that tone, and I internalized some of that doubt, started questioning whether my work mattered because my own brother didn't think it did. That damage doesn't disappear overnight." Ethan nodded. "I know. And I'm willing to put in the work to rebuild trust if you'll let me. I'll correct the record with Mom and Dad and Olivia. I'll acknowledge publicly when it's appropriate that I was wrong about your service. I'll respect your boundaries and your security requirements. I'll do whatever it takes." We talked for another hour, working through specific incidents and patterns of behavior, establishing boundaries and expectations for future interactions. It was difficult and uncomfortable, but it felt productive in a way our previous conversations never had. Ethan was finally listening, really listening, without defensiveness or excuses. When we left the coffee shop, we didn't hug or pretend everything was fine, but we'd established a foundation for potentially rebuilding our relationship. Over the following months, Ethan followed through on his promises. He called our parents and had a long conversation where he acknowledged he'd been wrong about my military service and had let his ego and insecurity drive him to diminish my accomplishments. He told them that while he still didn't know details of what I did, he'd learned enough to recognize it was significant and important, and that they should be proud of me. Mom called me afterward, crying, saying she wished she'd understood sooner, and that she was sorry for not recognizing how Ethan's behavior had affected me. Dad sent an email that was awkward but sincere, saying he'd always been proud of my service but hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that, especially when Ethan was being dismissive. Olivia posted something on social media for Veterans Day specifically honoring my service and mentioning that her sister did important classified work that she couldn't discuss but deserved recognition for, which felt like her own way of making amends for not taking my career seriously. The next Thanksgiving was different. Ethan came alone, having apparently learned his lesson about bringing friends to family gatherings who might witness his behavior. When conversation turned to military service, as it inevitably did, Ethan actively redirected any comments that suggested his infantry experience was more legitimate or important than my intelligence work. When Dad asked if I could share anything about what I'd been doing, and I gave my standard "it's classified" response, Ethan added, which means it's important enough that the government prohibits disclosure. She's doing work that matters, even if we don't get to know the details. It was a small moment, but it mattered. The acknowledgement that secrecy indicated significance rather than insignificance, delivered by the person who'd spent years arguing the opposite, felt like progress. We weren't back to whatever normal had been before, and maybe we never would be. But we were building something new, a relationship based on actual respect rather than childhood hierarchy and ego-driven competition. My military career continued on its trajectory, driven by mission requirements and performance rather than family validation. I made major 2 years after that Thanksgiving, completed another deployment, and eventually transferred to a teaching position at a training facility where I helped develop the next generation of intelligence professionals. The work remained classified, the specifics still hidden behind security protocols, but the people who needed to know understood its value. Ethan and I developed a functional sibling relationship built on clear boundaries and mutual respect. He stopped asking about my work beyond general questions about my well-being and career satisfaction. I made an effort to acknowledge his own career achievements in finance, recognizing that my earlier dismissiveness of his post-military path had probably contributed to his defensive behavior. We weren't close in the way some siblings are, but we'd moved past active hostility to something resembling genuine family connection. The Thanksgiving incident became a reference point in our family, the moment when assumptions got challenged and relationships had to be rebuilt. Mom still apologizes occasionally for not understanding sooner. Dad makes a point of thanking me for my service at every family gathering, sometimes awkwardly, but always sincerely. Olivia treats my military career with the same seriousness she'd always shown Ethan's, asking thoughtful questions and respecting when I can't answer. And Ethan, to his credit, has become one of my strongest defenders in family situations, shutting down anyone who suggests intelligence work isn't real military service. The irony isn't lost on either of us. I'm 36 now, still serving, still doing work I can't describe to the people closest to me. The secrecy remains frustrating sometimes, the inability to share achievements or explain challenges. But I've learned that the right people understand without needing details, and the wrong people won't be convinced no matter what evidence you provide. My value as a soldier and as a person isn't determined by whether my family comprehends the specifics of my job. It's determined by the work itself, by the mission's success, by the respect of colleagues who know what we do and why it matters. Everything else is just noise. Nathan reached out to me a year after that Thanksgiving, apologizing again for not recognizing sooner what unit I was with and asking if I'd be willing to speak with some junior personnel at his company about the importance of intelligence support to operational success. I politely declined because giving that kind of talk would require discussing classified organizations and methods I still couldn't acknowledge. But I appreciated that he'd thought to ask, and that he understood why I couldn't accept. He mentioned that his friendship with Ethan had survived but changed, that he'd been blunt with my brother about the disrespect he'd shown, and that Ethan had taken the criticism seriously. Small validations from unexpected sources. The military taught me many things over my career, tactical skills and technical knowledge and leadership principles. But one of the most valuable lessons came from that Thanksgiving disaster. That sometimes vindication arrives through other people's recognition rather than your own words. That credibility can't always be argued for but must be demonstrated or discovered. And that the people who matter will understand even when you can't explain. My brother learned his own lessons from that incident, about humility and respect and the dangers of assuming you understand situations you actually know nothing about. Whether those lessons stuck permanently remains to be seen, but at least he's trying. And sometimes trying is enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.